All right, welcome back, everybody, to part two of Let's DM with Bryan and Dragons. If you'll remember last time, we used a program called Inkarnate to begin the process of building our map. So we developed the land that our map was going to be, and my hope is that you are following along and that you have your own developed land now. Today, we are going to be adding geography to our land. It's really easy to it's really easy to overlook the value of geography as a part of your world. I would argue that geography is the most valuable part of any sort of homebrew campaign, and I say that for a few reasons. The first being that geography really is what creates the variety of your map. Imagine a homebrew world that was an entirely flat, slightly grassy plain with no trees, no rocks, no mountains, no hills, no rivers, no ocean, just flat plain as far as the eye can see. That would be a terrible homebrew because there would be no variety, right? When we're talking about geography, we're talking about the expectations that geography sets. There's a good way to think about this. Let me ask you this question. Where would you expect to find a bear? I'll give you a second to answer. My hope is that the process that went through your brain is, well, first, I would expect to find a bear in a forest. Makes sense. And then our little contrary part of our brain, the contrarian that lives inside of all of us, kicks in and says, but also there are bears that live in the frozen tundra, right? Polar bears. What doesn't come into one's brain is a bear walking and meandering through a desert, right? A bear in a desert would be an anomaly. And that kind of expectation, that sort of categorization and hierarchies of thoughts and where we put things is what helps us as a dungeon master create effective, compelling scenarios. For example, if you were to have a party that's wandering through a forest, just to continue on with the bear metaphor, if you have a party wandering through a forest and they come across a bear, there's a really strong chance that the party is not going to imagine that anything is funny about this. They're going to guess it's just a bear, and it can turn into a combat, a pretty reasonable encounter, definitely. Now take that same party and put them into, once again, a desert, and they come across a polar bear walking through a desert, or even a black bear or a brown bear. The party themselves are going to look at this and they're going to see it as being the anomaly that it is, and they're going to approach this situation very differently. They're probably going to do a lot more checks. They're probably going to be quite suspicious of it, as well they should. And that's a different type of encounter that's just as valuable, right? It's suspenseful, it's mysterious, it adds a bit of spice to the gumbo of your campaign. Another valuable part of geography is that geography can create dynamic elements within a game. One of my favorite uses of geography is allowing the geography to either hinder or help the party depending on where they are. And each geographic locale can have its own hindrances and its own boons. For example, one of my favorites, deserts add points of exhaustion if you travel for more than 4 hours during the daylight, right? Either forces the party to travel at night and sleep during the day, in which case you have interesting encounters, or they have to combat exhaustion, or they have to move very slowly. It adds a lot of dynamic play to your homebrew world. Another pretty common one is mountains and snowstorms that cause issues with visibility. Otherwise, hypothermia can be a pretty big obstacle for parties. Conversely, it can also help the party, right? Geographical dense copes of trees can hide the party from something that's chasing them. A cavern full of stalagmites can be shot at to fall on top of enemies in the midst of combat. We see this both in pretty common in Dungeons and Dragons games, but also has made its way to video game ports, right? That's Baldur's Gate 3. Before that, what's the name of that game? Solasta You could do that in Solasta as well, and both of those, it adds elements to the combat. Outside of cities, the only real interactive elements that parties are going to come across are geography. And I include ruins within geography as well, even though those are technically man-made, but if they've been abandoned, I count it as part of geography. The dynamic elements of combat are obviously really important, or else combat gets really boring, right? What is combat without being able to throw a rock or push an enemy off a cliff or try to fall a big icicle onto a foe? It adds so much to the game, and that's why it's valuable for us as dungeon masters creating our homebrew world to have a diverse, wide array of geography that we can lean on to add variety, to add dynamic elements, and to add encounters of both a rare and an average kind. So let's go ahead and dive right on in to our world. You will notice that I made a few changes, made it a little bit different. So this is the land of Red Tree. If you haven't given your world a name yet, I would recommend giving it a name so that you have at least something to call it, something to talk about. Mine is going to be henceforth named Red Tree. So inside of Inkarnate, what we're going to do to begin putting geography onto our map is we are going to open up the stamps section over here. The stamp tool, it looks like maybe a small castle. I always kind of think of it as a chess piece, but anyways, we're going to want to open our catalog of stamps, and specifically we are going to put in mountains. Now, obviously, there are a pretty significant number of mountains that we can choose from. For my world and just beginning geography, I don't want anything too crazy. I don't want any giant magma mountains. I just want regular, good old-fashioned mountains. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this stamp. Now, what's cool about Inkarnate is that you can set size and density. So for our mountains, we are going to go ahead and turn down the size, maybe do about yay. And then we're going to go into advanced settings, and we're going to go down here into area and density. So we're going to make our area slightly bigger, but the density slightly smaller. There we go. That feels like for our world, for the world of Red Tree, a pretty reasonable mountain range size. Now, depending on your world, how big you want the mountains, where you want the mountains put on your homebrew, it might be different. This is just for me. I spent some time thinking about what I want this to look like and where I want the mountains to be specifically within this world. And what I decided was I wanted a mountain range maybe here. I wanted one mountain range that extends across and one small mountain range here. And it's just that easy. Bam, done. We've got our mountains for our geography here. Next, we are going to want our lakes and rivers. For that, what I would suggest is this draw tool up here. You could also, if you want to subtract land from a very small size, that might even actually be better. I'll show you both, what they both look like. So first, if we want to add water with just the paintbrush tool, then we can do that, and it will look a little bit like this. Now, what you'll notice, unfortunately, is that if you do it with the paintbrush tool, even if you choose, let's see if we find one that looks really watery. If you choose any of these waters, it's not going to look quite as natural. This is better, I've found. Like, the paint tool is better for in Inkarnate specifically, the regional maps, as well as the battle maps. Do you see how what it's missing is the highlighting of the coast, the shadows, and the jaggedness. So what I am going to say instead we do is we actually go to the digging tool, the masking tool. where we can add and subtract land. And we're going to go ahead and just subtract the land away around here. And then you'll notice it will make a beautiful looking lake. Wonderful. Now we also need rivers. One thing that I want you to keep in mind is that generally rivers will flow from mountains to the seas. This is a mistake I actually made in my current campaign. I had a river that was running from the sea into the mountains, didn't realize it, and had to have that discussion with my players whether we wanted to retcon that in or have it be some sort of anomalous river effect. Anyways, something to consider if you're really trying to add immersion to your geography. So for rivers, we're going to want to reduce our roughness so that they're not quite as rough. Obviously, this is not going to work for rivers. It's going to be way too much, and we want it to be small. And we can go ahead and just start at the mountains and river our way, winding into the coast, into the sea. Now, why don't we put another one here? I feel like Bob Ross. A happy little river here. And maybe one right here that snakes and is long. Awesome. And maybe one that stretches this way. Perfect. Okay, so we have rivers coming from our mountains going into the sea. We don't have any on this side, but I was kind of thinking maybe our swamps would be over instead, maybe more so on the south side of the map. But we have our lakes. Obviously, we can see a number of large lakes, some small lakes in our world. We have our rivers, we have our mountains. Okay. Now, we want to figure out if we want to add any desert elements to our world here. For variety's sake, and just to show you how we can use this tool to actually add deserts, what I was kind of thinking would be that our desert could be down here by this small series of islands, and we can turn this into somewhat of a deserty area. We're going to go over, this is where we are going to use the brush tool. And you'll notice that inside the brush tool, there are barren, sandy, desert-esque lands. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this texture just because I think it looks the most, the most deserty. We're going to make the size a little bit bigger just so we can cover more area. And what's amazing you'll notice about this is that it won't obviously paint in the ocean, which is nice, which is another valuable part of the masking tool rather than painting on our rivers, is that we can, if we want to, go around it completely, go around our lakes completely, specifically, and not have to worry about filling anything in. But anyways, so now we have a small desert here in our land, just like, we're adding some variety. Now let's go ahead and we'll add a swamp. We're going to add a swamp in the exact same way. We're going to go here to our paint brush, and we're going to find something that looks swampy. So let's see here. Land, ice, snow, lava, water. So it looked like the best swampy lands are up here. Now we could choose this black wasteland. We also have this more kind of gray land. What I'm thinking, I like how kind of sinister looking this is. And I wanted to make this area under the mountains specifically a swamp that drains into this large swampy lake, possibly where maybe a monster is lurking. So now we have a swamp, we have a desert, we have our mountains, we have rivers. All we need really now is a forest. Now the forest, we're actually going to go back to our stamping tool in order to be able to add our forest. We're going to type in trees, and we're going to figure out what kind of trees we want for our land. Now, depending on the kind of trees that are in a forest, it's going to change the expectations that we talked about earlier, right? There are going to be sometimes snowy trees, a forest of entirely made of palm trees and cactuses obviously is going to be different than a forest made of pine trees But because I live in Colorado, I have a penchant for pine trees. So we are going to go ahead and choose pine trees. Once again, we're going to go back down to our area and density tool. We don't want it to be this dense. It's just too dense. I think something maybe about like this should be just fine. Area-wise, we're going to drop it down. Now, if we zoom back out, also, please excuse me, I do have a slight cold, so if I seem nasally, that's why, and I apologize. Zooming out and looking at our map, we notice that there are a few places where maybe a forest could logically grow, right? I'm kind of thinking these open areas, maybe right here, possibly over on this side. We could put some forest up near these coastlines if we want to, but generally I try to keep forest more on the interior of the land. So why don't we go ahead and put a small forest here. And then over here, I don't love these 3 lakes here. What I'd like instead is maybe for this to be one large forest. So we're going to go ahead and go back to our masking tool. We're going to add some land, paint over that, bam, done. Go back to our stamps and let's put a nice big forest right here. Perfect. All right, so we have 2 forests, we have mountain ranges, we have a swamp, we have a desert, we have islands over here, which is, for me, I feel like one of the last real parts of geography. We're still feeling a little bit barren just looking at this map, but we will be adding cities and remembering that grassland is important too. But why don't we go ahead and add just a little bit more forest there. I feel like something needs to be down here, but I don't know exactly what. I might give that a little bit more thought before our next video of what goes down here. A lake this size, I mean, that's a pretty significant lake, depending on how big we want to make our world. So we might change that. What I would advise you to do is begin the process of making your geography in the same way, and then come back to it. Come back to it maybe tomorrow, come back to it the next day, look at it, play with it in your brain, and come up with something that just feels right. But this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the geography for my new homebrew, Red Tree, and this will be the beginning of your geography for your homebrew world. If you are following along, maybe post a picture of your homebrew beginnings down in the comments. Thank you for joining us today for this second video. We always appreciate any and all viewership. Please like, please subscribe if you want to see this content, or want to see more content, rather. Next time on Let's DM with Bryan and Dragons, we are going to be adding our cities. So very exciting. We are going to be adding our cities. We are going to be adding our villages. We are going to be adding our towns. And then once we get all that in, we're going to start the process of naming. Yes, we are going to individually name all of our elements of geography, every forest, every desert, all of our cities, all of our towns, everything on this map is going to get a name. That won't be next time. That's actually going to be on episode 4 of Let's DM, but just giving you the roadmap here. Once again, I am Bryan and Dragons. I thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for joining us on Let's DM Episode 2 Geography. Go forth and homebrew.